Rebecca Schmid was a Fulbright combined grantee in the 2002-2003 program year, which allowed her to both conduct a research project and teach English. What motivated her to apply for this specific grant, and what impact has the experience had on her career?
I had a project researching a contemporary of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart named Ignaz von Seyfried. And that project required research in the archives, which was the basis for a lot of my later research. I ended up writing my dissertation about Kurt Weill, which is something totally different. But some of the skills I acquired there, among other things, making mistakes, researching in the archives, because you learn from mistakes. And it was a project that was quite challenging for a musicologist of my age and level. But again, I learned a lot. And at the same time, I was teaching at a high school in the 22nd district. So it required a lot of juggling in terms of my schedule. But the teaching experience was also very fundamental for what I do now, because I still teach in Vienna. And it was a very different experience, obviously, going out there to a high school, coordinating with the teachers there, coming up with content for these high school students. So I saw very different sides of Vienna, doing research in an archive in the first district, then going out to a totally different district. And I think that gave me a very realistic picture of Vienna as a city that stays with me until today.
During her time in Vienna as a combined grantee, Rebecca also delved into the cultural landscape, working as a journalist within the arts world.
So during that time as a combined grantee, I also took advantage of the cultural landscape here. So again, it was a lot of juggling of my schedule, but I was young and had the energy to do all these things. And I was at the opera all the time. I was at the Leopold Museum, for example, in the Museumsquartier right around the corner from the Fulbright office. And I was there all the time and became obsessed with some of the expressionist art of that time. I was introduced to Egon Schiele for the first time. And I just wrote an article about Egon Schiele, about an upcoming exhibit at the Leopold, and in connection with some other topics around Egon Schiele. So that, to me, provided a kind of continuity that was very satisfying. And I interviewed the granddaughter of an art dealer who was originally from Vienna, emigrated to New York, and introduced Schiele to New Yorkers. At first, no one bought his painting. The first exhibit was still during the Second World War. It wasn't until 1951 that someone actually bought a painting in the United States, Minneapolis. During that time, going to the Leopold and other museums as well, but that museum in particular was sort of a hangout of mine. I understood the music of the early 20th century so much better by spending time with those paintings and reading about the cross-fertilization of art and music and science and design at that time. And that's something that I think a lot of people would agree is just an extremely rich period in history that's emphasized also in the courses that I teach at Webster. Like I said, it's an extremely satisfying combination, having done research here and taught, and having the opportunity to take advantage of the cultural landscape here, not just in music, but art. And none of these things are isolated from one another. If you want to really understand classical music in any period, you have to understand what was happening politically. You have to understand what was happening in visual art. All these things are connected. And Vienna, in its comfortable size, provides a very nice opportunity to study that specifically in Vienna, which I continue to teach and write about.
Rebecca still lives in Austria and teaches music history at a U.S. university. How did her Fulbright experience prepare her for the binational nature of her position at Webster University?
The experience of getting to know Vienna's cultural city as an American was a very welcome opportunity to dig further, specifically into the history of Vienna, because I am Swiss and born in France, so I had quite a healthy context for understanding European history. But the history of Vienna is very specific and very complicated because this was part of an empire. And I think from an American perspective, it's difficult to understand. So now I feel like I finally get it 20 years later. Some of the topics that I was introduced to, the imperial history, this connection between art, science, music, which you can spend a lifetime exploring. And I now have the wonderful opportunity to teach, to pass on some of the things I was exposed to then, and explain why it's important and why it's interesting to young people who might not think it's that interesting when they first arrive, and hopefully they leave with a totally different perspective. And as a journalist also, some of the experiences I made back then remain the basis for being able to write an article about an art exhibit and write about classical music here. I was at concerts a lot. Vienna is an absolutely amazing place. You can literally be at a different concert every night.
Being a Fulbright program participant also means serving as a cultural ambassador between two countries, a role that Rebecca has continued to fill in Austria since she was a combined grantee.
I think it's important that we don't forget the connections between European cultural history and American cultural history, because there is so much continuity and rupture, of course. And in times like these, when things are changing very fast in ways both positive and negative, we shouldn't forget that European culture and American culture are inextricable. You can't just say, this is European, this is American. There are these very strong connections that remain unbreakable, basically. As for the topic of being a cultural ambassador, I think that the narrative about Europe, the United States, these various parts of the world, we're entering a time, paradoxically, in a time of globalization, we're also seeing a lot of provincialism, like make this country great, and which is fine, because in fact, every country has to defend its own interests and defend its own culture and promote its own culture. I think it's important maybe not to be judgmental about a given country and a given culture, but to be able to see it from this multicultural perspective. So if I'm able to somehow communicate that in my writings as a journalist and academic writings and as a teacher, then I think I'm somehow contributing and somehow fulfilling my role, or fulfilling the opportunity that was given to me as a Fulbright scholar 20 years ago.
As an alum of Fulbright Austria's programs and a longtime resident in Austria, Rebecca is a great source of advice for future applicants and program participants.
I would say that anyone who's given an opportunity to study as a Fulbright scholar in Vienna should consider themselves very lucky and to take advantage of it in as many ways as possible. We're living in a time that's actually unstable in many ways, and Austria is incredibly stable compared to many parts of the world. That in itself is a gift, but that doesn't mean that one can't think critically about things in a constructive way. I would say that that's an extremely important thing to take into consideration when you're given that kind of opportunity and responsibility. But the main thing is just to learn as much as possible, to have an incredibly open mind, to let it change you in the sense that you understand how people in a totally different country think, and embrace it and grow.